And it says we're recording. Hey, Jim.
Okay.
How are
Good
you?
morning, Sean. How are you?
Not too bad. First of all, thank you very much for doing this. I know you have, even though you're working from home, you have a fairly busy schedule still. So this is hopefully the first of many of our sort of 30-minute chats. And to sort of get people up to speed on why we'll do it, I first want them to get a sense of our individual backgrounds, and then I'll explain how this conversation came about. So you get to fire first.
All right, lightning round.
Yeah.
So, thanks for having me. And these are great discussions, and I know that they circulate a lot around data privacy, security, and I guess real world applications. So, it's always good to see that. And for myself, I spent 26 years with the U.S. Secret Service as a special agent, investigating all types of fraud, identity theft cases, and cybercrime towards the, I would say, last decade of my career, and doing that at a national, international level. Last 5 years, I've been out in the real world, as we used to say, working working as a security consultant, investigator, and really, as I see myself, as kind of more of a risk manager than anything else. Working for an accounting firm, and now working in a subsidiary of a law firm with a very small consulting group that focuses on these areas. So, public-private, I've seen it from both ends as a criminal investigator, as a business owner, and as someone who works with technologists like yourself, Sean, and with insurance brokers and consultants as yourself, Sean. So,
well, I think that's a good segue. So he's Jim Matola. I'm Sean O'Rourke. Now, in my current stead, I'm a cyber liability consultant for an insurance brokerage and consultancy called Combs and Company. Prior to that, I spent 20 years in IT trying to keep people out. And now, as Jim mentioned, I look to prepare companies essentially to be hacked. And that's the best way to put it, because that's really what's going to happen to every company if you're in business long enough. So with that out of the way, this video came about because you had an idea for an article that we started talking about, and it kept mushrooming into longer and longer and more words. And we thought, people probably aren't going to take all the time to read it, but they might take 30 minutes to check out a quick video on the topic. And the topic that you started was a health identification card. And obviously, as you said, you had a public-private background. And let's start with the public background, just to give people some context from whence this idea originated. You worked and lived outside the United States. So you have an idea of what documentation looks like, especially identifiable documentation looks like overseas, primarily in Germany. So let's start there. Give me an idea of what Germany has versus what the US has in terms of documentation.
The primary document, and the reason for our conversation really is what I think that Germany and other EU countries have, and quite frankly, a lot of countries have, is a national identification document. Right?
Yep.
And I think that's so. Even working in Germany, and in the diplomatic capacity, I was still issued a Ausweis, so a national ID. And that ID for EU citizens is something that can be used to travel within the EU without even a passport. So nationally, it's recognized by my German friends are going to correct me here. Mm-hmm. I think there's 16 or 17 member states in Germany, but every state does not issue its own ID like we have here in the U.S. Right?
Gotcha.
We have one national ID, and there's also one national driver's license, which makes it pretty simple. So harkening back to my days of, as a criminal investigator, when people would present the identification to you, you didn't necessarily know what the driver's license looked like from Arizona or Missouri or Wyoming, right? If it's in New York City. So that always presented a challenge. But when traveling throughout the EU and internationally, having one document, I think, makes a lot of sense.
And that document was strictly identification purposes.
Right, identification, yes.
Yeah. So there was no additional information on there outside of what maybe is on a U.S. driver's license, let's say.
But it's more, think of it more as like your immigration status, right?
Okay.
So for me, it's a different immigration status than somebody else. So,
Yep.
So it's kind of like an immigration card and an ID card put together, which is nice. But to your point, I think where we're going with this, it's a very static document, right?
Yep.
It's paper. There's something printed on it. There's some sort of security feature. Voila, right?
Yep.
Like a driver's license, right? But driver's licenses are now there is some sort of a barcode or something on a driver's license so that verifies or validates the information on the front. Like when you go to TSA, you check in, right? There's something that validates what's on the front because what's on the back. Not sophisticated technology, simple, easy to implement, and readable technology, right? What we have in our DLs now.
Sure. And so, and just to give people a context from law enforcement, you made mention of this. It's difficult to know exactly off the top of your head when you're looking at a driver's license in New York City that says it's from Wyoming, that's a legitimate driver's license. And also to your point, even if it has something on the back, you're not necessarily carrying a device that will allow you to scan it to legitimize it. So you're sort of sitting there trying to guess whether or not that's a legitimate document, correct?
Right. So basically what you'd have to do is I told you back in the day, we used to have these books, and the books would list every, driver's license in the U.S. and territories. And you would go through and you take a look at it, or you'd have to call your office in Wyoming or, in Missouri to, hey, look, can you guys run this DL and tell me if it's legitimate or not? Now, I would assume that systems for local police are much more integrated than they were back then, but still, you have to take that driver's license, you'd have to do something with it. You're not able to determine the validity of it right off the bat. It's a step that's not necessary. And quite frankly, if we even look at, I can't imagine that you would ever do this, Sean, but at some point in time, I'm sure you may have had to alter a driver's license to get into a local, restaurant or
an establishment of some sort.
Establishment, right? For networking purposes.
Right.
But look at kids today, college kids, like drinking age is 21. Come on. I mean, so where are they getting these driver's licenses from? Overseas, right? They're buying them and they're using them, and they're, so that driver's license is usually good enough to get them in someplace. Now, using that for official capacity, and I would caution no one to do this, don't present that driver's license to a police officer or a TSA or anything else, because now you get a situation where it could be identity theft or what have you, depending on how it is. But the bottom line is it's still difficult. We don't have a national ID. So if we're looking to migrate, to something that's a little bit more sophisticated, right? What is it going to take to get there, and what's in place already?
Right. Well, and that's a lot of where our conversation started. And I think for you, the materials that you had sent me, some of it was based on Dr. Fauci's announcement during the initial rise of that fear cycle with COVID-19 about having a health certificate or an immunity certificate, I think is what he called it. That would be a document to essentially allow you to be released, saying that you either had the antibodies, you were immune, whatever that might be, or you tested positive. Now, obviously, that never came to fruition, especially as these states start to open and whatnot. But to that point, it led to the conversation that we had about identification, but that creates something that has to be a little bit more dynamic. And that was your thinking on there, is that the documentation has the potential to be dynamic now, to have information above and beyond Jim Mottola or I'm Sean O'Rourke, and that's about it.
Yeah, I definitely think we need to take a quantum leap here from the current system that we have, which is a state-based system of bearing identification documents. Now, after 9/11, Congress and the Senate moved to pass a bill, and it required what was called then a real ID, right? Yeah. And the real ID basically said states have to have a uniform approach to driver's licenses and identification documents. Right? So that was something that states, I guess we can't run away from these devices.
Yeah.
That's my extended warranty, Sean.
There you go. There you go.
We'll never look. We'll do one of robocalls, but we're going to need an hour for that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
But the idea was that there would be a uniform identification document, right? States would have to do various things. And of course, it's just not just the appearance of the document, which needs to be more uniform and have similar information. But now we get into situations with data retention storage, right? That's expensive, it's time consuming. And states have really taken a long time to migrate. Now, the idea was that this identification document would be able to something that it would be federally approved, meaning you're Missouri and you submit it to Department of Homeland Security and they approve the design and you're good to go. But a number of states had to request for longer periods of time because they couldn't establish a way to store the documentation, make the documentation, right, and enable it. And now we're in a situation where, we've talked about this before, having the documentation ready for TSA, well, there has to be a star on it, some way that show that it's the real ID. Now, because of COVID, all this has been pushed back, right? But the part that I found so interesting is that now we're in 2019, 2020, and it still hasn't really been instituted yet, right? The real ID has not been instituted yet. And one of the things that we had spoken about before was the fact that there's a gold star, or there's a black star, or there's a white star with gold around it, or a white star with black around it on each ID. So every state can pick between 4 different star designs they want. Unless you're California and you get to pick your own, which has a star with a bear on it, or a bear with a star on it. Either way, okay, we can't even still have an ID that the federal government's approved that is the same darn document. Right? So how are we going to get to something that has data on it that is more than static information? Long story short, I think we need to do what other countries have done, and we have a digitally enabled document, right? And we talked about things like chip and pin technology. Pretty good technology. It's worked pretty well, right? It's the information on it isn't static. It changes all the time. And countries like, I believe, Malaysia have instituted a chip and pin technology for a national ID, right? So we need to go from state ID issued to national ID that's uniform with some sort of, technology-enabled way to retain, store, and transmit data in real time. And I think that's the only solution that I feel that can implement something that's for security purposes and for, again, changing conditional purposes, if we're going to have a national ID, rather than how many pieces of ID do you have in your wallet and you carry around with you?
Well, I have my driver's license, I have my health insurance card, I have my dental insurance card, but neither of those two have pictures on them, so nobody will accept those. Obviously, I have credit cards, chip and pin, and then I have my Metro card, which I bought with a credit card. So technically, according to Law and Order, you can track me down anywhere from that.
Right. So I think that's the problem. We've got all these bits and pieces of these documents, And if we're going to integrate them into something that is useful, right?
Yeah.
And if it's, like, so we actually talked about the other document traveling overseas was your shot card, right? That yellow.
Right. Oh, yeah.
The yellow shot card, right? Your Hep A, Hep B, malaria, whatever you're thinking. I mean, and that's a document that really could be integrated, or it's more of a physical status, and I don't mean that in a way, but it's a physical condition that allows you entry, and I think that's what we're going to have to go to. That's something that can be read nationally, internationally, and that's uniformly deployed. And honestly, thank God for the credit card industry, because they figured out how to do this, right? Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover. This is something that payment system I think, allows for an infrastructure, and you could argue on the type of infrastructure, but an infrastructure that actually does work and is deployable and creates something that can be verified real time.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and you mentioned the word technology, which is always, to some people, a four-letter word. To us, it's a means to accomplish an end goal, but we also understand the risks that come with it. So then my question for you is just, again, we're not getting into the details. There's so much that have to go on when you get into the details. But when you look at the technology, and we'll get into the implications of the data portion, are you looking at this as strictly a federal effort? Is it a federal state effort? Is it a federal, state, and private effort? How do you see a solution like this being workable? Forget the politics and what have you, but being workable from a technical perspective.
What I saw in the government in my last few years there was the fact that government decided or knew that it couldn't. It needed the private sector, especially when it came to cybercrime intelligence. It needed the private sector to help it be more to just be more efficient in this area, right? And I think we've seen a lot of public-private partnerships in cybercrime and in technology. And I think this is going to be that solution. I think it's going to have to be a public-private partnership in order, because even if you look at the way that vaccinations, right, are done and will be done, and testing, right? Yeah. It's through existing commercial enterprises, right? And I think that's going to continue. Like, if you think of a company like CVS, what a great distribution model, right? It's all over the country, right? And there are businesses like that, and Walgreens and whatnot. And I think, the distribution model of the driver's license is a great. It exists. It's physically there, but that's government. I think it's a tough one. I think you're going to need private industry to help solve the problem of creating the ID, deploying the ID, and actually securing the data as well, and transferring the data when it's necessary in a practical application. And
to your way of thinking, are the states still involved in this, or do you think it's a federal-private deal? I know that was a question that we really didn't touch on, but I just came to mind.
I think this is and if I'm going to get inside of your head for 30 seconds,
careful,
scary thought, yeah. Right? But I think it's, where's the revenue, where's the risk, where's the liability?
Yeah.
So I think those are the questions. Are we taking revenue away from the state? Who's going to assume the liability, and who's going to assume the risk? I don't know. I think you need to have, it may be state, federal, and corporate.
Okay. Well, and that goes into our next question, was the risk. Obviously, anytime you digitize a piece of data, or you plug or you make a device connectable in some fashion, you've exposed it to a myriad of risks. on the technical side. So you touched on it, where the liability lies is still to be questioned. But do you think the technology, you mentioned chip and pin, do you think the technology does exist or can exist that will safeguard things enough to where people can feel confident that I can carry this with me and know it's secured on the back end?
I think there's another question there. The question is really, is the technology convenient enough for me that I am willing to accept that there is some risk, okay? Because what we see in data breaches and identity theft is, where do the damages really exist for the user, right? Credit card fraud is one of those silent killers because we're not really inconvenienced very much when our credit card has been compromised. Usually we get a card the next day or two, okay? And most likely those charges are not going to be our responsibility, right? So, but at the end of the day, we pay fluctuating rates, rising rates, right? And that's what our cost is. But really, as a consumer, unless my identification is used to purchase something, a value like a house or a car or something, I may not see that. I may not. I'll be more impacted. So I guess the question is, does the convenience outweigh the risk, and what's the actual impact to a person holding the ID? If my information gets stolen and I'm not able to board an aircraft, that's a big inconvenience. That's going to make me mad, right? People can't get in. I'm sorry, sir, your ID doesn't work. So, I think when we put all our eggs in one basket, that's going to present some issues, and we've got to figure out how to have some redundancy.
So you may need safeguards on there,
right? So you may need to carry. You may need to have. There's other solutions out there, right? But you still may need to carry that physical driver's license or that passport, which is a great document, right? It really is universally accepted, at least on this planet. I can't speak about others. Universe is bigger than the United States.
It's a big place.
It's bigger than a place. Yeah, it's a big place. It could be somebody else out there. We'll do another one on that. Yeah. But I've never been to Area 51, or what is it?
Area 51. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never been there, so
I don't think our passports would work there.
But the bottom line is that it's a great document, but it's a little cumbersome. Yeah. And if you lose it, you're in trouble. You're really in trouble. Try to go to an embassy overseas and get something reissued, to get on the flight. Tough. So I think we've got to figure out what that fail-safe is, what that any technology is going to require some sort of redundancy, whether it's other technology or something physical that's not less technical and inconvenient, but still works.
And I like the way you put it, because that's what technology is all about, is the convenience to the user. Mm-hmm. And I think anytime you make something more convenient, you make it less secure. So this isn't going to work unless it's convenient and secure, which is, we've talked about it before, what Estonia is doing with their national health information and their efforts to utilize blockchain. Again, it'll be a conversation for another time. So the last question that I have for you is just, a pie in the sky one. Does this happen, let's say, in our lifetimes? Because we're around the same age. So does it happen now, or do you think this is something that we're just having a conversation on and probably will never happen?
I think we're going to be probably in our mid-70s before we see this.
Okay, but at least it's our lifetime. I'm good with that.
I think it'll happen, and I don't know what is going to be the driving event for that. A health crisis, as the one that we're in right now, Could be that, but again, there's so many unknowns, even with your status. And I mean, it's whether you have it or you don't, whether you have immunity or not. There's so much that we don't even know about this disease that it's not something that anybody would want to put on a document and swear to, right?
Right.
But I think the situation is such that there's going to be some reason why we need to move to a national digital ID in the future, and I think we're getting closer to that. But again, it's driver's license and IDs it's a revenue generator for the states as well. So I think our structure as the United States is kind of what we're up against in order to make this happen from a practical standpoint. We may have a hybrid. We may have a chip and pin on our Missouri or New York driver's licenses, right? So I think this is going to be an evolutionary process to the point where we get to something like, dare I say, license plates. Okay, they're the same size.
Yeah.
They're different colors, but they're all the same size, right? But even within every state, you might have 5 or 6 different license plates, right? So I think there even presents some issues there. We have to get to something, that is, again, I think we're going to be moving towards this, but it's going to take a while to get there. So the long answer to your easy question was, we're going to get there at some point, but I don't think we're going to see it for quite a while.
Okay. Well, I tend to agree with you. I think there will be an impetus to go, and I also agree with you. It'll be in fits and starts. It's not going to be like a clean sweep. It's going to be, okay, we'll do it here. We'll do something like this. We'll do something like this. And who knows, there may be somebody right now in a garage coming up with a new security measure that makes this more practical in 5 to 10 years. So any parting shots before we sign off and let these good people go?
Yeah, the only thing we didn't really talk about is a biometric.
Oh, do you think that's practical from, well, how do you mean it in terms of making the basically your information through biometrics, or adding biometrics to like a chip and pin card?
I think it's another factor, right, that you can stick in, for authentication, and really your thumbprint doesn't change very much. Now, interestingly enough, India has gone to biometric IDs, right? But one of the things that they found out that folks, the ridges and swirls on their thumbprints had been worn, some of the folks, just through manual labor.
Yeah.
So that itself isn't perfect, but I think there are countries. I think we should look, outside, see what other countries are doing, and to see what that right mix is. It might be biometric, it might be chip and pin, but I think you've got to validate all the time. You've got to validate that person behind the ID. So I think we're always going to have pictures, and if we don't have pictures, then we're going to have something else that you can validate, like a fingerprint or I guess
an iris scan.
Your iris scan, right? I think that's going to exist, but again, like voice recognition software and things like that, technology isn't perfect yet. There's flaws, and until we get to the point where we are sure about the functionality, then I think that's what it comes down to. So we're really, we're stuck in this world where we have folks that are in their 80s and 90s, and and are recently born kids and generation that we're in this digital and paper world, where we still write checks and we Venmo.
Yep.
And
so
I think
it's a transitional period to a certain extent.
It is. It's going to be a transitional period, and I think that at some point, a lot of this stuff is going to go away, but it's going to take a long time to transition. Like you said, in fits and starts, and I think that'll happen. But the data that we put on those cards, it needs to be something that we're sure about, and that we're confident that it reflects. A vaccination would be able to reflect
Right.
a certain immunity for a certain period of time based upon science. We don't have enough information right now to even put something on an ID. I think that's useful.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, it's the practice of medicine, as they like to say, not necessarily the science of medicine. So to that end, where we started as a health ID kind of conversation and evolved that into a national ID, yeah, I think people, one, you said convenience. Two, they have to trust the information that's put on there and to a certain extent be able to control it. And three, it's got to be safe for them.
Right.
Well, that'll do it. Thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it. Hopefully this is the first of many. And for all of you who actually watched till the end, much appreciated. If you have your own thoughts or comments, wherever you're seeing this video, there will be space to post those, and we'll try to respond if we can. And until next time, about Area 51, I'll talk to you soon.
Over now.
Bye.
Bye.